No matter how much I'd like to avoid drafting certain players, there's always a breaking point where they've fallen far enough to justify taking that risk. Most of the time you aren't faced with that situation though, and you're happy to let them go to whoever's willing to value them that high. That's where I'll likely find myself today with this list of players, and I'm perfectly okay with that. I'm Dave Loughran with Awesemo.com, counting down the top 3 overvalued wide receivers to avoid in your drafts. But before we get started, hit that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into it. Tyler Lockett has the ability to win weeks for you in fantasy football. But can he win you leagues? I guess that depends on which of the weeks he decides to go nuclear and which ones he disappears. Lockett posted a top 10 finish at his position last year, but his end-of-season numbers don't tell close to the entire story. Get this. Lockett caught a career-high 100 receptions, tied his career-high in touchdowns, and was 3 yards shy of tying his career-high in yards. But 37% of his yards, 36% of his total receptions, and an insane 80% of his touchdowns came across only 3 games. That's right. Lockett combined for 36 receptions, 390 yards, and 8 touchdowns in those 3 weeks alone, where he was the wide receiver 1, 1, and 5. Those were some amazing games and surely helped carry you to head-to-head victories. But what about the rest of the season? If you remove those weeks, Lockett was the wide receiver 36. Now, it's not fair to just remove 3 huge weeks and consider his season less than it was. But the problem with Lockett is that in those other 14 games, he was the wide receiver 50 or worse on 7 different occasions and only finished inside the top 20 twice. Both of those weeks came early in the season, too, when Russell Wilson looked like the frontrunner for MVP. But none of this even takes into account how the Seahawks offense functioned early in the year, and also how their piss-poor defense forced them to be more aggressive through the air. Lockett benefited a ton from Wilson attempting a career-high 558 passes, but we saw things begin to balance out later in the year when the defense showed market improvement and the backfield got healthy. Having huge weekly upside is a major positive for any wide receiver, but it can be a lot less valuable when those explosive games are few and far between, especially when, after last year's late season offensive implosion, Pete Carroll emphasized his desire to get back to his roots and run the ball more. I wouldn't say Lockett's 47 ADP is outrageously high, but as the wide receiver 21, he's far from a priority for me. If you expect Aaron Rodgers to play a full season for the Packers this year, ignore this next player. Actually, don't ignore him. Do the exact opposite of what I'm about to say and draft him on every single team at his current ADP. I'm obviously talking about Davante Adams, who was an absolute monster last year, leading the league with 18 touchdowns and finishing behind only Alvin Kamara in fantasy points among all players. Adams was also 2nd in receptions and 5th in yards despite playing only 14 games. The Packers decided to draft a quarterback and a running back in the first 2 rounds last year instead of providing Aaron Rodgers with help at receiver. But that didn't stop him or Adams from enjoying huge statistical seasons at their respective positions. The problem heading into 2021 is there is a definitive possibility that Rodgers won't be on the field for the Packers. Even if Rodgers is 60-40 to suit up, there's still reason to be hesitant about drafting Adams at 17 overall. Here's why. First, DeAndre Hopkins, who finished with an identical number of receptions and 1,407 yards but only 6 touchdowns last year, is being drafted directly behind Adams. Touchdowns can be fluky, though, and Hopkins has racked up double-digit scores in 3 of his last 6 campaigns. He's also on a Cardinals team that is far from stacked at the receiver position and has played at a top 5 pace in both seasons under Cliff Kingsbury. Second, Calvin Ridley has an ADP of 20 and is being drafted behind both Adams and Hopkins. Ridley was the wide receiver 2 in 7 games that Julio Jones missed last year and the wide receiver 5 on the season overall. And that was with Jones starting 9 games. I'm all about taking on risk in fantasy football, but I prefer to avoid it in early rounds. Because just like with Adams, there are always going to be some elite alternatives that you can draft with confidence. And one more thing on Rodgers. It's not like he's a mid-tier quarterback whose replacement should still be able to keep Adams in elite wide receiver territory. In 2017, Rodgers played and completed only 6 games. Adams was the wide receiver 4 in those games and the wide receiver 12 in the games that Rodgers missed. It's not an insane drop-off, but it's surely enough to proceed with caution when you roll into the mid to late second round and have this exact decision to make. We still have Davante Adams ranked all the way at the top of his position at Awesemo.com, for good reason. That's because, well, of course, we're not factoring in Aaron Rodgers being out. but I have reservations about that, and I feel pretty good about the surrounding players close to his ADP in Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones. Before we get to our number one overvalued wide receiver, don't forget to hit that thumbs up. And if you're watching this video on our main daily fantasy channel, you'll be happy to hear that we just launched the Awesemo Fantasy Football channel right here on the YouTube, bringing you exclusive fantasy football content every day of the year. Go check it out. Mike Evans posted his 7th 1,000-yard season last year, which means he's never finished with fewer than 1,000 yards in an NFL campaign. But while he's achieved yet another milestone with the Bucs in 2020, his season wasn't exactly all it was cracked up to be. Evans was hugely touchdown dependent, finding the end zone 13 times on the year. That's a huge plus for any receiver, especially considering Evans was top 10 in red zone targets. But there are some concerning areas about his game that could rear their ugly head this season. First, Evans had an 18.5% target share. And even in a high passing volume offense, it still only worked out to be less than 7 targets per game. He had 2 games in the first 3 weeks of the season where his only 3 combined receptions were 1-yard touchdowns. Sure, the touchdowns are super helpful, but Evans failed to eclipse the 80-yard receiving mark in 12 of 16 games. Actually, he came in under 60 yards 10 different times and barely squeaked past the 1,000-yard mark despite playing a full season. And Evans' 109 targets were the lowest mark of his career. Touchdown dependency is one thing, but what about the fact that Tom Brady spread the ball around at one of the highest rates in the league? Evans' 18.5% target share actually led the team, and that's without considering Chris Godwin missed 4 games and Antonio Brown only played 8. So while I haven't even mentioned the fact that Tom Brady can't continue to play at an elite level forever, and I refuse to take that angle because analysts have been predicting a steep drop-off for years now without any success, it's just one more variable to consider heading into 2021. It all boils down to this, though. Outside of the 13 touchdowns, all of Evans' marks were a far cry from where they've been in the past. And considering he's come nowhere close to those touchdown totals over the previous 3 seasons, there's plenty of cause for concern drafting Evans at wide receiver 15. I'd much rather draft Julio Jones on an equally efficient offense with potentially less passing volume, but a far more condensed passing game. Thanks for watching, and be sure to head over to awesemo.com for all of your fantasy football needs. See you back here in the next one.